Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. Ukraine War News Update, third part thereof for the 8th of July 2023. 2024, goodness me, time flies. We have a French electoral situation to get our heads around at the moment. Some might say it's time to apologise to Macron for ridiculing his decision to call a snap election. Others might say, actually, there is still an awful lot to sort out and an awful lot to worry about concerning the political landscape in France. It depends how you read the situation. So what has happened? Well, there have been these coalitions that have formed to try and fight off Rassemblement National, the French right wing, well, not just right wing, far right wing, under Marine Le Pen. The Rassemblement National and allies formed a bloc to the right. Then you had a kind of centrist bloc, and then you had a left-wing bloc, and the Rassemblement National coalition did not get the 289 seats needed for the majority in order to form a government in the National Assembly. The final results, says French aid to Ukraine, have just been announced, or this is some time ago. There could be 324 of 577 of the districts for MPs, including Les Républicains and excluding the LFI, one of the far left parties, who fully support Ukraine. In other words, there's a plurality, there's a majority of MPs who are Ukraine supporting, assuming that the far right Rassemblement National do not support Ukraine, and indeed the far left do not. Although there's argument as to exactly what the far left really do think, because they have ascribed to a position that does support Ukraine, even though Mélenchon, their leader, doesn't. So interesting. If the entire new Popular Front bloc keeps its promise, and this is it, and the independents are counted, then 424 of MPs could potentially support Ukraine. And that's a point about the LFI, who, you know, Mélenchon doesn't support Ukraine, but actually they've signed up to supporting Ukraine. So this could be good news. It could still be quite challenging in trying to sort something out, but we'll come to that, because actually some good news, as far as I'm concerned, has been announced today. Right, okay. So here is how it looked in terms of the coalitions. What's really frustrating is I'm struggling to get a definitive calculation of the party MPs who have been elected. These are the coalition. So you've got the coalition of the Rassemblement National and allies, as it says down there, 143 out of the 577. You've got here the left-wing coalition, which is the NFP left-wing alliance. They've got 182. So they've got a larger coalition there, but that is a coalition because actually this brown area is mainly Rassemblement National. So as far as Rassemblement National are concerned, as a party, they've had the greatest success, as in they have the most MPs. But as far as a coalition goes, they have lost out to these other coalitions, and that's important to note. You've got the centrists here, who Macron's coalition with 168 in the middle. So that's looking good. You know, it's looking like they've come second as a coalition, with Rassemblement National and allies being pushed as a coalition into third place. And then the centre-right here of Les Républicains and other conservatives there, forming another section. So that's good news. That is a rejection of the far right. Now, interesting map here of France as to where these districts are situated. It looks like, interestingly, you know, Normandy, Brittany, and other places in the north west are fairly centrist. We have the left wing further to the south here. And then right on the south we have a large area of Rassemblement National, as well as scattered throughout, and particularly in the northeast, the industrial areas up in the north here, Lille and other places, under I presume Rassemblement National and allies. So an interesting geographical split, as you would expect in any country. I don't know about the rural urban divide. I don't, you know, it'd be interesting if someone probably French would have more indication of the type of the rationale for the geographical situation for who has voted for what. And then we have here, this is an indication. This isn't the final vote, so this was one of the exit polls or one of the estimations before the final ones came in. But I'm going to use this because it gives you an indication. So here are the three coalitions. So you've got the pink coalition there, the NFP. You've got Ensemble, that's Macron centrist coalition in the middle, and you've got Rassemblement National there at the bottom there in that, I think it's black or certainly very dark blue. And those are the coalitions. But when you look under the coalition, Rassemblement National as a party had the huge majority in that coalition. So when you're looking at parties, they are much bigger than all of these other individual parties. And that is what's important. And I think this gives you, I think this is accurate, okay, rather than being an estimation. So we have Rassemblement National having 125, and that is much bigger than the next biggest, which is Ensemble, which is the presidential majority of Macron, having the second biggest, being the second biggest party per MP. So that was quite surprising. I wasn't expecting that. And then you have LFI, which is the far left there, having 78, and parties, the Socialist Party there, 69, the Green Party, Écologiste, 28. And then others here and there. We got, the Les Républicains, centre-right with 39, and so on and so forth. So you still have the situation where the Rassemblement National are the biggest party now in Parliament, single party, even though their coalition it wasn't. And whatever happens, Rassemblement National are on the political scene and they appear to be there to stay. These are serious players. And the question is going to be, how does this parliament work? And if it doesn't work, who's to blame? And what is the prognosis for Rassemblement National going forward? Like, how do we see them generating more support or less? You know, what is going to happen? And of course that will be determined by how successful whatever parliament, whatever ruling coalition takes place, and how that deals with Rassemblement National. Rassemblement National will, I'm sure, enforce a reaction from the others to take into account the growing threat of the far right in France. And I think, just like in the UK, Labour will be looking at Reform and how they completely split, because we don't have proportional representation. Reform only have 5 MPs, but as far as an electorate goes, they have a huge proportion of the British electorate, or not huge, but much bigger than was previously the case. If you go back sort of 20 years, you only had the Conservative Party. Now you've got the Conservatives on a much smaller footing, but as far as MPs are concerned, much greater than Reform. But as far as voters are concerned, Reform are a good 15% of the electorate or something like that. And so Labour will be looking at them saying, right, if we don't take into account some of their needs and desires, we will see that grouping expand. We will see those sentiments start to grow in the country. And so do we just repudiate that kind of desire, or do we take it into account and say, okay, we need to be harsh on, say, immigration? That seems to be the biggest issue. So how Labour deal with immigration will dictate what happens with the Reform vote and with the far right vote in the UK. And the same here. So how whatever parliament there is, or whatever administration there is, how they deal with something like immigration will dictate whether, I think, Rassemblement National grow or not. And so whatever you think of this electoral result, Rassemblement National will have a major effect on French policy. And the question is, will that translate into a dampening of support for Ukraine, since Rassemblement National seem to have more support for Putin, more sympathies with Putin and less sympathies with Ukraine? Now the question then is, well, does that translate to the electorate, or is that something that people like Bardella and Le Pen have at the top? And if so, do the MPs have those same views with regard to Ukraine and Putin and Russia is going to be interesting. You could see a dampening down of pro-Ukrainian sentiment due to Rassemblement National being serious contenders now. But you won't get Rassemblement National in the administration. They will not form a government, I don't think. That's how I interpret it. I'm no French political expert, as I'm sure you can tell. I assume that some form of centrist centre-left government will form. It might even include the Les Républicains. There might be some kind of coalition there, but of course there will be lots of arguments. There could be some form of electoral paralysis going forward until 2027, and then Rassemblement National come out and say, look, you see what happened? Nothing happened. It was complete chaos. You want to vote for us? We need to be president, and we need to have the most MPs. And so it could, that kind of paralysis could be a recipe for success for Rassemblement National. But what has been seen is that with this massive French turnout, people did come out and generally reject the far right. But the far right is still there, right? And someone like Tendar here says something that many have said. Any Conservative party or movement that degrades itself to be just Russia's pawn is not conservative. It's a sellout. Italy's Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni learned this lesson, won the elections, and holds very firmly to her position. Le Pen, respectively, with RN, didn't do their homework, and shortly before the second round of the elections even tried to appease Putin. They chose poorly. Now, I would like to know if there's any data to suggest that Ukraine and Putin and Russia had anything to do with them doing more poorly on election night than they were predicted. Now, what happened is Marine Le Pen went on CNN and had this big interview with Christian Amanpour, who Le Pen in that interview came across as very much a Putin appeaser, very much anti-Ukraine. And for people like me, that played very poorly, right? How did that play in France? What effect did that have on possibly dampening down some of the support for Rassemblement National? I don't know. I'll be interested to see. Giorgia Meloni in Europe has bucked this trend of being a fairly right-wing, very right-wing leader, but one that doesn't support Russia, is not under the spell of Putin, although her deputy prime minister, Matteo Salvini, is. And there is a tension within Italian politics where La Lega and certainly Salvini, in coalition with the Brothers of Italy and Forza, they particularly are pro-Russian. Forza, Silvio Berlusconi was a friend of Putin. So there is a connection there, but Giorgia Meloni isn't like that and is very serious with her support for Ukraine. And it's actually, I think, come out today and declared that the strikes on the hospitals were war crimes. So there is a very strong rhetoric, and Le Pen could look to someone like Meloni and say, okay, if we want to be successful, if we want to be seen as the grown-ups in this, or seen, if we want to be seen as grown up, as not some kind of fringe, a bit like Marjorie Taylor Greene in the US. Like if we want to be taken seriously, then we need to start thinking in terms of serious geopolitical strategies, in terms of how would we be seen regarding wars involving Europe and the EU, and maybe we should temper a little bit our crazy edges, in particular our support of Putin, right? So this could be a case of good role model from Giorgia Meloni. Now, okay, we've got these results. We'll have a look to see what might happen. Indeed, The Guardian has a good explainer here of what might happen. So could the NFP hope to form a government? Against all expectations, the NFP alliance, so that's the alliance of the far left and centre left, alliance of LFI, so that's far left, the Socialist Party, centre left, and Greens and Communists, centre left and far left, will be the largest force in Parliament, but it's still a long way from the 289 seats required for an absolute majority. Mélenchon, a veteran firebrand, on Sunday demanded Macron appoint a prime minister from the alliance and implement the entirety of NFP's programme. So just to take you back to those stats then, in fact, this one here is as good as any. So that's to say these guys here are saying, or at least Mélenchon is saying, you need to elect because the president, Macron in this case, gets to elect a prime minister, and as long as that they don't get censored by a majority in Parliament then, or in the National Assembly, then that should get through. And Mélenchon is saying, you need to elect one of our guys, and we need to have our entire kind of agenda fulfilled. And actually, that's not going to go down very well with pretty much everyone else. So there's still a lot of bargaining to be done. And actually, it's unlikely that's going to happen. And we'll come on to this in a second. France's constitution allows for the president to choose whoever he wants as prime minister. In practice, because Parliament can force a resignation of the government, the head of state invariably chooses someone who will be acceptable to the assembly. Normally, that would be someone from the largest bloc in Parliament, but appointing a radical left prime minister would run the risk of repeated no confidence votes backed not just by the centre right and far right, but possibly from the president's camp too. So going back to here, thing is, someone on the far left is clearly not going to get any support from anyone on the far right. If you select someone from the centre, then you will get people from over here saying, yeah, okay, that's acceptable, and people from over here saying, yeah, that's acceptable. So it's far more likely that someone from the centre is going to get through as a prime minister than someone from either the far left or the far right. And so I think the NFP are being, and Mélenchon being unrealistic in those expectations. Can a governing coalition be formed? Unlike many continental European countries, France has no experience of broad coalitions since the chaotic days of the Fourth Republic, but several figures from the left and centre have previously suggested it could be a solution to a hung parliament. The former Prime Minister Edouard Philippe, the long-standing Macron ally François Bayrou, and Greens leader Marine Tondelier were among those to say last week that an anti-RN coalition from the moderate left to the centre-right could unite around a basic legislative programme. So exactly what I'm saying there, something like this looks like a sensible option of having a majority over the 289 parliamentarians needed for a majority, and a coalition that's going to get enough people because it's moderate and goes to the moderate left and moderate right to be neither far left nor far right, and also broadly in support of Ukraine. You would think so, and that's really positive. That may or may not happen. So there's going to be all these arguments as to what kind of coalition takes place. I won't go into any more detail there. There is another option: ad hoc alliances, a technocratic government. What else is possible? So rather than attempt to put together a formal coalition government, the outgoing Prime Minister Gabriel Attal suggested last week that mainstream parties could form different ad hoc alliances to vote through individual pieces of legislation. Macron has tried this strategy since losing his majority in 2022, but with limited success, having to resort on numerous occasions to special constitutional powers, such as the unpopular Article 49.3, to push legislation through without a parliamentary vote. President could also consider appointing a technocratic government. So technocrats are experts, basically, of the kind familiar to countries such as Italy, made up of experts. I think Netherlands does this to a degree, made up of experts such as economists, senior civil servants, academics, diplomats, and business or trade union leaders. But it doesn't have particular form in that area, and so this is all kind of slightly new ground. So there are all these different options as far as what will happen. The question is, will whatever happens be beneficial to Ukraine, or at least even if it's not beneficial, not like bad, okay, for Ukraine. So something's bad for Ukraine would be to have someone from the far left and someone from the far right take on the position of prime minister. And it's not that this is going to be definitely pro-Ukraine, but it's not going to be anti-Ukraine. Okay, if you go to the centre. And in fact, the latest we are hearing is that the French have, Macron has asked Gabriel Attal to stay on temporarily. This would be really good news. And I think personally, Attal would be a prime candidate to stay on permanently. So he was already prime minister. He was very strong in support of Ukraine. He was very strong in trolling, actually, Marine Le Pen for her support for Putin. And I think would be a really good solution here, which is, okay, more of the same. And people on the far right might not be happy with that, and people on the far left likewise. But again, it is going to be, he's a proven politician who has done the job of being prime minister and has done it fairly well. And someone that people in the centre and the moderate left and moderate right could coalesce around. And it means you wouldn't have this like huge paralysis that's potentially on the card. So that's really, I think, as far as I'm concerned anyway, really good news if Attal does take that position on at least temporarily until something more permanent is able to be accomplished. I don't know. One worry is that Jordan Bardella, who was the Rassemblement National potential prime minister that Marine Le Pen was going to put in, or no, she wouldn't, but the pressure would have been on Macron to have put in as prime minister had the Rassemblement National got 289 votes and across the line in terms of having a majority. He has now set Rassemblement National on a course of definitely being pro-Putin in joining or leading this new parliamentary group in the European Parliament. So if you remember the European elections for the MEPs, member of European Parliament, they work, because everyone comes from individual country parties, they have to work in coalitions. And you have these big, broad coalitions taking up different areas along that spectrum. And you have a number of these far-right coalitions, like the Identity Group and EPP and so on and so forth. Well, the Fidesz, Hungarian party of Viktor Orban, was kicked out of the one that actually had Marine Le Pen's Rassemblement National in it, as she kicked, I think, Fidesz out. And now Rassemblement National are going to get into bed with Fidesz in creating this new party, or being part of this new party, with Jordan Bardella at the top. So the French far-right National Rally, Jordan Bardella, has been selected to be the chair of the new Patriots for Europe group in the European Parliament, a Hungarian government spokesman has said. The first vice chair will be Kinga Gál from Viktor Orban's Fidesz party. So there is this potentially upstart Eurosceptic pro-Putin group developing in the European Union with Rassemblement National as members. So when we wonder whether Rassemblement National will take that position of looking at Giorgia Meloni and saying, okay, let's go to somewhere, like if this was a European parliamentary spectrum, somewhere over here, let's be sensible, let's try and moderate our fringe views, and let's do the Giorgia Meloni and say, yeah, we're going to be anti-Putin. But instead of doing that, they've jumped into bed with Viktor Orban, his Fidesz party, and they seem to be going down the pro-Putin route. Here, French aid to Ukraine says, finally, the Rassemblement National's elected MEPs will sit in the new far-right group founded by Viktor Orban, the Patriots for Europe, for fear of reviving suspicions of pro-Russian sympathies. The RN did not want to announce this before the second round, which I think was interesting. Like they waited until the elections were done before announcing very publicly that they were going to get into bed with Fidesz and therefore essentially with Putin. A great picture here of Viktor Orban kissing Marine Le Pen's hand. I think that tells you everything you need to know. Sorry to spend so much time on this, but I think it's good to get at least something of an understanding. Now, going back to continue spending more time on this, the NFP, so that's the left coalition, which includes Mélenchon and his party LFI. Here, Michael Weiss says, NFP, that coalition, their official stance on Ukraine, in spite of Mélenchon and his cohort at the helm, says this: Le Pen wanted to end all scalp deliveries to Kyiv, but actually NFP have said on Ukraine, the full translation here is sovereignty and liberty of Ukrainian people to be defended, including by arms deliveries, oligarchs' assets to be seized, blue helmets to safeguard nuclear power station. That would have to be decided by the UN Security Council though. So here we have a situation where actually this whole group has agreed to support of Ukraine, including arms deliveries to Ukraine. And even if Mélenchon is saying, well, he is saying a big no to that, he has signed up to that previously with his coalition. So, yeah, lots to be sorted out there. Now, moving away from that French situation, hopefully that gives us some context there. As I've discussed in my previous video, Britain's John Healey, the Defence Secretary, has been out in Odessa. John Healey here saying, in Odessa today with Zelensky, that's yesterday, I made clear that Britain's commitment to stand with the Ukrainian people is steadfast. We will step up UK support. So it's not about keeping the same, it's about taking it one step further for Ukraine with a new military aid package and stand shoulder to shoulder with our Ukrainian friends for as long as it takes. Of course, still with that for as long as it takes line, I prefer for victory, etc., etc. Now, David Lammy, the foreign secretary, for the Labour government, has also accepted an invitation from the EU Foreign Affairs Chief, Josep Borrell, to attend the September meeting of the EU Foreign Affairs Council, something that was rejected by the previous Conservative governments. Okay, let's go through this actually, because although Keir Starmer has said that there's no chance of, not in his lifetime, he reckons, or at least while he's in government, no chance of UK rejoining the EU. There is a move to get closer to the EU, and don't worry for all Euroreform voters, not in a like immigration kind of way, but in a security alignment way, which I think is really super important. And this is good news. I think no matter where you sit on Brexit, leave or remain, this kind of positioning is, I would say, quite universally decent idea. So Labour to seek joint declaration with the EU on wide-ranging security pact. So Labour is seeking a sweeping joint declaration with the EU to usher in a wide-ranging security pact covering defence, energy and climate crisis, pandemics and even illegal migration, the Foreign Secretary David Lammy has said. As part of the new government's plan to reset its relations with the EU and bring an end to the Brexit era, Lammy told The Guardian that a broadly defined security deal would not undermine Labour's commitment to remain outside the EU single market and customs union. Under Labour plans, a pact would see UK work more closely with the bloc on a slew of areas related to security, ideally with the need for without the need for a legally binding deal that could take years to agree. So it's not like binding ourselves into something and having like rules from the EU dictate how we work. This would be something that you've kind of heard the rhetoric from Boris Johnson saying, hey, yeah, we've left the EU, but we're still, close to our European partners and we'll work closely with them, all that kind of carry on. Well, this is that, but taking it to a kind of more formal state. Under Labour plans, Lammy has also accepted an invitation from the EU Foreign Affairs Chief, Josep Borrell, to attend the October meeting of the EU Foreign Affairs Council, something that was rejected by the previous Conservative government. It is rare for non-EU states to attend the Foreign Affairs Council, and Labour thinks it may be possible to go on an irregular basis if the planned security pact develops. This is great because it actually gives us an influence into Europe, and it also helps us. Like, this is to the benefit, like, it's better working together on things like security than working on your own. It's just, that's why we have NATO, right? So I personally see this, and not just from a pro-EU point of view, but just I see this as a benefit to all involved. So in an interview during his first trip to Europe as Foreign Secretary, Lammy said, quote, "We said in our manifesto we wanted an ambitious security pact, and that's because we have been speaking to Europe about this for the last few years. And I think there is an appetite, particularly following the war in Ukraine and the challenges that EU faces in relation to energy and climate, to go broader than just defence." It's interesting that Labour have been talking to the EU, actually, putting things in place in case of an eventual electoral win for them. Quote, so you have to obviously get into discussions with Europe and find those issues of mutual interest. My hope is that once, of course, a new European leadership is in place, we can progress with a joint declaration of some kind. Obviously, underneath that would be buckets of work streams. It goes on to say later, I'm serious about a reset. I sensed in Poland and Germany, they were delighted to have a new UK government. We are absolutely clear that we want to look to the future. I think there's a lot of issues that we have to coordinate on, but it is all a matter of negotiation and discussion, but I've set the direction of travel. The broad issue was raised by Lamy with the Polish Foreign Minister, Radoslaw Sikorski, who said they had discussed, quote, some creative ideas on future cooperation. Poland holds the presidency of the EU next year and is likely to be a key ally in persuading other EU states that the UK is not seeking a backdoor way into accessing the single market without taking on its responsibilities. Within the EU, the need for greater defence cooperation alongside NATO has normally been championed by French President Emmanuel Macron, and the UK is aware that Anglo-French bilateral defence cooperation is in a period of flux as Macron fights for his political survival. So lots going on there. Some really interesting political machinations. The UK positioning itself quite closely to the EU without overstepping its mandate from the electorate with regard to, you know, hopping into the EU. But I think that kind of cooperation is beneficial to both sides. Now, talking about NATO and the EU, Viktor Orban has arrived in China. Remember, he's just gone to meet Putin in Moscow, and that's peed everyone off to the point where do we have it? Your Peter Pavel is not happy. Here he is. Let's bring him over to here. So in reference to the latest heinous Russian terrorist attack against the Children's Hospital in Kiev, Czech President Peter Pavel released the following statement. The attack on the Children's Hospital in Kiev and many other Ukrainian cities is proof that Russia's Putin will stop at anything. Attacking the most vulnerable is excusable. I'm about to leave the NATO summit where I expect a consensus that we all see Russia as the biggest threat for which we must be thoroughly prepared. Sorry, that's more to do with NATO than to do with having a go at Orban. But actually, Petr Fiala, his prime minister in Czechia, was very strong on condemning Orban for going to both, I guess, well, going to Moscow. And I guess people are probably a little bit less annoyed about going to China, although they're, at least publicly, but that'll be very much a point of disdain under the radar. I mean, he's doing this without the endorsement of the EU. This is kind of like real maverick behavior from Orban. So he has the presidency of the EU on that rotating basis at the moment. And the first thing he did was go to Kiev. Then we should think, okay, fair enough. And then he goes straight to Moscow. And you're like, are you just giving away all the details from Kiev? And then goes to China. And we know that Hungary are close to China. China are involved in Hungary's they have police force involvement. There's this Belt and Road Initiative with Serbia and Hungary. There's a railway between the two, I think, that is being funded or at least sorted out by the Chinese. There's an awful lot of connection between Hungary and China. But China, obviously, facilitating the war in Ukraine with their support of Russia. And this is, again, Orban just working counter to the intentions and objectives of both the NATO and the EU. It's just absolutely incredible. Now, Mick Ryan says in the next 48 hours, NATO will hold its annual summit. He said this last night. This time it will be hosted by the US in Washington, D.C. There will be a range of topics discussed, including the war in Ukraine, but China's role in supporting Russia may also be a subject of some discussion. In June, so Mick Ryan is a retired Australian general. In June, the US permanent representative to NATO described how, quote, China has taken a side. China has opted to support Russia through the provision of these dual-use components, and that if it opted to stop doing that, we believe it would have a major impact on Russia's ability to conduct the war on the ground inside Ukraine. But how does China benefit from supporting Russia and indeed benefit from the continuation of the war? I think there are three key areas where it does so: strategic, economic and ideological. Strategic benefits. The first strategic benefit to China is that the war in Ukraine is absorbing much of the attention of key strategic decision makers in the United States. Another strategic benefit for China of a prolonged war in Ukraine is that it provides a gigantic testbed for Chinese ideas about future war in the Pacific. Economic benefits over the past 28 months since the beginning of the Russian large-scale invasion of Ukraine, China's trade with Russia has increased markedly. So that is shown there on the graph, where we see here April 2022. So this is trade with Russia, was right down here, and then it absolutely went through the roof, relatively speaking. Chinese monthly exports have grown from $3.9 billion to around $9 billion. China's massive growth in exports to Russia and purchase of Russian energy also gives it more leverage over Russia. Ideological benefits, as the 20th Party Congress in 2022, at the 20th Party Congress, Xi Jinping described how China remains at threat from external actors and that the external environment is getting worse. China clearly sees the opportunity to ideologically cleave more nations, especially those in the so-called global south, away from American influence. We've seen this with BRICS inviting Saudi or looking to take on Saudi Arabia, Zimbabwe, a number of different countries looking to join there. Then we've had Vietnam being on the cards, and other nations of strategic importance for the global chess players. And with Russia confronting NATO and the West in Ukraine, China does not have to do all the heavy lifting in a broader ideological confrontation with the West. If China is going to convince their other nations that it can provide a better design for global prosperity and security than the one provided by America since 1945, it helps to have another major nation on board. In the early 2000s, China benefited from the US focus on counterterrorism operations inside the US, as well as the American expeditionary operations into Iraq, Afghanistan, and at a smaller scale Africa. The Chinese Communist Party may see a prolonged war in Ukraine as a similar opportunity. As such, the Chinese Communist Party and President Xi are probably comfortable with the war continuing for some time. Unfortunately, they appear to have more to gain from its continuance than its ending. As one Russia analyst recently explained, quote, "The war in Ukraine may be a drain on the West's resources and on the economies of developing countries, but it suits Beijing's interests just fine. I've long said that they will benefit from Russia losing the war just as much as they benefit from Russia winning the war. So I don't think they particularly mind too much. But actually now, I say on balance, if Russia wins, that's better. But if they lose, they can just go in and pick up the pieces and help themselves to both geographical areas of Russia and the hydrocarbons and natural resources in Russia by saying, hey, we're your best mate, we'll come and help you out, we'll get you off your feet. So I don't think they have a problem with Russia losing, but they probably will gain even more if Russia wins. But with China deriving substantial strategic... So China's position, on the war will almost certainly be examined at this week's NATO summit. But with China driving substantial strategic, economic and ideological benefits from the war, a variety of robust diplomatic and economic measures will be needed from Western nations to convince Xi to step back from his support for Russia. Whether NATO members are willing to take such measures and whether they could succeed remains to be seen. Interesting, this NATO summit is going to be, compared to any other NATO summit we've ever seen, probably the most closely observed. Now, South Korean President Yoon Suk Yeol has said in an interview published on Monday that Russia, says Tenda, German source, Russia has to choose whether South or North Korea is more important for its national interests amid deepening concern about military cooperation between Russia and North Korea. Quote, military cooperation between Russia and North Korea poses a distinct threat and grave challenge to the peace and security of the Korean Peninsula and in Europe, Yoon said in an interview. And since North Korea already supplies Russia with weapons, says Tenda, I consider this a rhetorical question. It is highly unlikely that Putin and Kim will or even can withdraw from their commitment. South Korea will have to react accordingly. And I'm a little frustrated with South Korea because they are in such an amazing position to be able to help Ukraine so much more. And they are teetering on the edge of doing so really publicly, but they seem to be waiting to see what Russia gives to North Korea in return for North Korean ammunition. And that might have to wait some time before some of this tech gets in, maybe missile tech, maybe space tech or whatever it is gets into North Korea. And then they say, all right, now that's the permission. They don't seem to be so worried about North Korean stuff going to Russia to be used against Ukraine. They're more worried about stuff coming from Russia into North Korea to be used potentially against South Korea. And so, unfortunately, I think there's a bit of a lag before we see the action that we could be seeing right now from South Korea. They're in such a good position to help Ukraine. I really wish that they committed more overtly to that. Now, Viktor Orban apparently took bribes from Russian organised crime led by Semyon Mogilevich in the 1990s when he first became prime minister, and was subsequently recruited by the FSB through blackmail. Mogilevich himself works for the SVR. So this is a Hungarian news source talking about this. I don't think this is particularly unknown. If I remember correctly, when I was researching my article on Tucker Carlson and the Heritage Foundation and the support that they get from Russia through Hungary, I was doing a lot of reading around Viktor Orban and how he came to power, because he's changed over time. He started off more on the sort of communist left and now is on the ultra-nationalist fascist right. But he has a lot of connections to Russia, a lot of mob connections, and this has long been known. It's just unfortunately probably stifled in the public information spaces in Hungary. Viktor Orban is not a good leader with great amounts of integrity. Not at all. Anyway, probably something I should look into in an extra or something. I never seem to have time to do extras these days. President Zelensky and Polish Prime Minister Tusk have signed a security agreement. So Zelensky's in Poland at the moment. Indeed, there have been offers of MiG-29s to Ukraine if they can be backfilled, like I reported earlier. And a further thing that's just come out is that there appears to be the offer and or the request. I think it is looking likely that Poland are going to shoot down Russian missiles that get close to the Polish border but inside Ukraine. That is super good for Ukraine. That would be a real help there. So yeah, Gabrielis Landsbergis, as I've already said, states this: Putin sends his greetings to the NATO summit by bombing a children's hospital, as if any clarification was needed as to why Ukraine must have all possible support now and real guarantees for security in the future. So the NATO summit could end up being really positive for Ukraine, precisely because Russia have decided to do this massive bombardment of Kiev and other places around Ukraine that has taken out 3 medical facilities, a maternity ward, a children's hospital. I mean, goodness me, you can't think of any other way than to garner support for Ukraine than striking a children's cancer ward. You know, what are you doing? But anyway, that's what happened, and now NATO are going to go in saying, oh yeah, just a reminder, like, Putin's an absolute douchebag, and what Russia's doing is terrible. And here's the evidence that we're seeing right now. Oh, children being pulled out of rubble. Yeah. What should we do? Should we screw over Russia? Yes, we should. So I don't know. It seems to have been an escalatory move by Russia, either like out of stupidity or maybe just like, yeah, let's go crazy. Let's go in full tilt to this. Right, and I'm going to end on a bit of good news, which is in Iran, nothing to do with the war in Ukraine, but in Iran, the most advanced warship in the fleet of Iran has just capsized in port. I think it was just getting fixed up, and it's literally just capsized and sunk. So there you go. Stuff happens, doesn't it? And it's always good when it happens to the ne'er-do-wells of the world. Anyway, thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share. Take care. Speak soon. Toodle pips.